and High Representative. Please, Mr. Borrell.
I was saying, honourable members, señoras y señores diputados, señor presidente.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Parliament, President.
Iranians' attack on Israel and the need for de-escalation and about our response to these events. Yes, on 13th of April, Iran's attack against Israel was unprecedented. It never happened before. It is the first time that Iran directly attacked Israel from its territory with hundreds of drones and missiles. All this without forgetting the Israeli attack that preceded it and that we also condemn when this happened. This aerial attack represents a major escalation of an already very tense situation in the region, where we have witnessed dangerous games of attacks and retaliations and attacks. And I want to use the same words that the United Nations Secretary General Guterres used at the Security Council. He said, "The region is at the edge of an abyss." Yes, estamos al borde de un abismo, dijo el secretario general. No son palabras huecas.
These are not empty words. Undoubtedly, this continuous interaction of a war nature will lead the region, and all of us, actually, to an extremely dangerous situation. Now it appears that we've moved a little bit towards the abyss, the edge of that abyss. And we have explosions in Isfahan, in Iran, but neither of the two sides, neither Israel nor Iran, have used these particular explosions as a kind of springboard for escalation. There is the possibility of discussion, and our issue is to draw attention to the situation right now so this escalation doesn't continue and doesn't turn into further risk. It is an extremely volatile situation in the northern borders of Israel, with the situation with Hezbollah, where we've seen Lebanon once again embroiled in an extremely fragile situation. And the United Nations have clearly said that any mistake made by either of the parts may lead to a terrible conflict, further conflict. And the exchange of fire on the Lebanese borders has led to a situation which we haven't seen since 2006. The 27 leaders of the European Union, and we too, at the level of the Commission, we have sent out a strong message calling for peace. And in English now.
State, we have taken a strong stance asking all actors in the region to move away from this abysm that the Secretary General was mentioning. We discussed it at the Foreign Ministers level on Monday. We all clearly condemned the Iranian attack and confirmed our commitment to the security of Israel. There is a political consensus to expand the existing sanctions against Iran. The Foreign Affairs Ministers in a jumbo meeting together with the Defense Ministers took a political agreement that will be implemented on the next days in order to use the sanctions regime that we already have, because from time to time people ask for something that we already have. We have a sanctions regime against Iran for providing drones to Russia. Well, this sanctions regime can now be used to sanction the production and potential transfer of missiles from Iran to Russia. I'm saying the potential transfer, but also the production itself, and also to target Iranian delivery of such weapons in the Middle East and the Red Sea region. You know what I'm talking about. The Red Sea region will have a Navy mission to try to protect the freedom of navigation. Let me add that sanctions are an important tool, and we have used them to send a clear message to Iran about their dangerous proliferation activities aiming at the destabilization of the region. However, I think that we have to understand that sanctions alone are not a policy. Sanctions are tools of a policy. And sanctions alone cannot deter Iran. This should be evident after years and years of international sanctions. Iran is, together with North Korea, the most sanctioned country in the world. Sanctions alone cannot solve the risk of escalation, and place has to be given to diplomacy. Diplomatic action has to be equally important. I think this is a moment for diplomacy, to deploy maximum diplomatic efforts, to act to calm down the situation, and ask everybody to play its part. EU and member states were in touch with key actors because the EU keeps open channels with all sides. That's what we talked at the G7 meeting, Ministers of Foreign Affairs meeting in Capri some days ago. And as you know, I am regularly in touch with the Iranian Foreign Minister in order to stress him how deplorable are these attacks and warning that we are closer to a full regional conflict. In the past days, we also coordinated our efforts to reach out to Israel to show restraint and to Arab and Gulf countries to use their influence. We had a meeting with the ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council in Luxembourg. I think it was on Monday night, immediately after he came to Strasbourg to share with you the debates. But this was an important occasion for the ministers of foreign affairs of the 27 and the ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the states, to exchange about the situation in the Middle East. Well, the spiral of attacks and counterattacks may have slowed down. That's a very good news. But the situation remains stable, unstable, and dangerous. Finally, while we pay all the necessary attention to the Iranian attack on Israel and the risk of escalation, let's not forget what's going on in Gaza. You heard, you listen to the news, you read the news. Gaza remains at the epicenter of the regional tensions. It's the focus who is sending shock waves around the region and around the world. Gaza remains at the epicenter of the regional tension, and it will be like this as long as the war continues. And more fundamentally, that the Israel-Palestinian conflict is not resolved. So we have to be able to build peace and stability in the region, taking into account all the conflicts that are developing there, taking into account our absolute commitment for the defense and existence of Israel, but also to take into account the high human cost of the conflicts who are raging there. The European voice has to be the voice of the reason, trying to decrease the humanitarian sufferance and look for a stable peace that, from our point of view, can only be obtained through a political process that leads to a two-state solution. But this is another story. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kommissar und Hoher Vertreter.
Thank you very much, Commissioner and High Representative. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an important debate. This was decided on by the Conference of Presidents So please stick to your time. Mrs. Yuknevichene, please, 1.5 minutes.
General remarks. Why did Iran dare to attack Israel directly for the first time in history? I see two reasons. The first is deteriorating situation in Ukraine on the Eastern Front and Russia's factor. The second is the lack of political will and leadership on the Western Front, Washington, D.C. including. In the eyes of the terrorist alliance of dictators, the US looks weakened. That is the reason why they raise their heads and attack. This is why recent decisions in the US Congress are of existential significance. The democratic world is entering a period of political vacuum because of presidential elections in the US, European Parliament elections here in Europe. The political vacuum is a test for democracy in general and a temptation for terrorist states. However, it is not those who won this year's elections who will be mentioned in the history books, but those who failed to defeat the terrorist Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others, even though they had every chance. I still believe that we, the European Union, together with our allies, we can, that our leaders can go down in history as the ones who managed to overcome bloody regimes. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Yuknevichene.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Yuknevichene. Mrs. Garcia Perez now, 3 minutes.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The action-reaction spiral that Israel and Iran have undertaken sees them moving towards a regional war, and we need to put a stop to that. Diplomacy must prevail over the rhetoric of warmongering, which produces no solutions and just leads to more fear, more death, and more destruction. And given this, the European Union needs to stand firm and together. We are committed to Israel's security vis-à-vis an attack from Iran. And there's no better way to show our firmness vis-à-vis the Ayatollah regime than to widen our sanctions against Iran and its allies in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, our commitment to the defense of Israel should not be incompatible with us standing against what the Netanyahu government is doing and has been doing in Gaza for the last 6 months. Since Hamas's terrible attack, everything has got worse in Gaza. Over 33,000 dead, 1.5 million people trapped in Rafah, 17,000 children, minors, walking alone through the streets of Gaza, fleeing bombardment and looking for food and water. Over 1,000 children have lost one or both legs since the war began. Over 200 humanitarian workers and more than 100 journalists have been killed. Over 1 million people at extreme risk of malnutrition because of the use of hunger as a weapon of war. Ladies and gentlemen, what else needs to happen in Gaza for the European Union to double its pressure for an end to this conflict? It's not enough to open up crossings into Gaza. Food needs to go into the Gaza Strip immediately. We need to see the hostages freed as well. We need peace, and we need to see international negotiation for a peaceful future. International law is also at stake in Gaza, the way in which societies live freely and in a dignified manner. Let's raise our voices to ensure that Netanyahu complies with the Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire, and in order to ensure that the international community complies with the embargo on the sale of arms to Israel that was requested by the UN Human Rights Council. Mr. Borrell, you are the High Representative that ensured that the European awoke in geopolitical terms. You're the leader that made it possible for the European Union to speak the language of power, and we now have the historic opportunity to make our weight count. The European Union and its member states have the power to produce a solution in their hands. We can achieve the most noble thing that any people can aspire to, i.e. peace. We need to see peace between the Palestinian and Israeli peoples. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Garcia.
Thank you, Mrs. Garcia Perez. We now have Mr. Groothuis for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, dear Commissioner, colleagues. Dat Rusland, China en Iran samen op...
Russia, China and Iran seem to wish to form an alliance, and this is the question which we have to deal with. And Iran is being discussed today, and I'm very glad that during negotiations last night we did say that we were in favour of putting the Revolutionary Guard on the terrorists list. When actions have been carried out for several years, this has consequences. And we therefore wish to protect people better. There's a lot of work to be done in the digital sphere as well. Now, Mr. Borrell, a lot of what we say in our resolution should have happened some time ago. And the best moment to plant a tree, said somebody, was to plant that 30 years ago. So we need to have the Guard on the terrorist list. We have to stop the trafficking or the trading of weapons which are going to Ukraine and working against Ukraine and Israel. The time has come to put a stop to this. Thank you.
Es folgt für 2 Minuten.
Thank you. Mrs. Neumann now, 2 minutes.
Mr. Borrell, last week the Iranian regime celebrated its first direct strike on Israel, and it continuously violates vital provisions of the nuclear agreement. Sit and wait is no option, and more diplomacy alone will not be enough. We urgently need to work on a Plan B, a regional security architecture which addresses the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and preparedness for new attacks by the Iranian regime. And frankly said, what more does this regime have to do until you finally wake up to the harsh realities? The IRGC is a terror organization, and it should be designated as such. The drones and missiles attacking Israel and our ships in the Red Sea are manufactured in Iran, and we should have sanctioned all those involved in that months ago. And last but not least, the regime is not legitimately representing the people of Iran, and you should stop pretending it would. All these demands are included in our joint resolutions, and we expect you to finally implement them. Dear colleagues, the Middle East today is just a dangerous miscalculation away from an all-out war. It is on everyone, to stop repression and work towards de-escalation. And there are so many in the region who want nothing more than peace and an end to this suffering. Babies being born orphans after airstrikes. Families living in horror whilst seeking refuge from bombs night after night. Tormented hostages unable to hear the voices of their loved ones, and so much more. There are strong men on all sides. Hamas, Houthis, Hezbollah, in Israel as well as in Iran, that benefit from the recent escalation, and it is our collective responsibility, together with the US and regional actors, to move from this deadly balance of deterrence towards a peace-seeking balance of humanity, dear colleagues.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you, Mrs. Neumann. Now, Mr. Weimers, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Borrell, you're a liar. For a year, you've claimed that in order for the EU to list the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terror organization, a national authority in the EU must have found the IRGC has been involved in terrorist activity. That is nonsense. Here, I have the Council's secret legal opinion. Nowhere in this document does it say that it has to be an authority in the EU. In fact, the term competent authority also includes authorities of third states. High Representative, you had this document. You knew the truth. You shamelessly lied to protect the IRGC. We won't miss you, Mr. Borrell, but I'm sure the mullahs will.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Weimers.
Thank you, Mr. Weimers. Mr. Weimers. Using the word liar is unparliamentary. So we now have Mr. Campominozzi, 1.5 minutes.
Grazie, Presidente. Grazie al Teo.
Thank you, President, and my thanks to the High Representative for being here. We've come to the last session of this legislature, and many of the points that were said today were repeated many a time. And this Parliament asked for the Pasdarans to be put on the list of terrorists. The Commission refused to do so. Now, I understand some of the reasons for this, but if we find ourselves in this situation, it isn't because we need to divide ourselves between those who defend Israel and those who defend Gaza. I support Israel, but that's not the subject of the debate today. We have to understand why. There's somebody in the area whose interest it is to destabilize and to extend the conflict, because the first objective of the Iranian regime is to distract the part of the population which still supports it from repression, the repression of youth, of young men and women who have tried with courage to oppose it. And then we have the clashes between the Shias and the Sunnites, and then we have the bombings, the influence exerted on the Iraqi people, on the Kurds, on the Iraqi Kurds. My friends living in Erbil have told me of terrible things happening there. It's an ongoing conflict, but it's also a sign of weakness because the Iranian regime kills a lot of Muslims. It says that it wishes to defend the interests of the Palestinians, but it kills a lot of Muslims. Thank you, and let's remember that.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Campominozzi.
Thank you, Mr. Campominozzi. We now have Mr. Shirdowan for 1.5 minutes, please.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Now, the escalation of the conflict between Iran and Israel has brought the world to the brink of a major war, and the possibility of the situation spiraling out of control is still there. Iran, under the mullahs, follows its policy of the destruction of Israel, and this anti-Semitic madness must come to an end. Domestically, all progressive democratic forces are repressed. The wanton persecution of democratic forces, we have violence against women. Now, the massacre of October 7th marked the first day since the Holocaust that so many Jews, men and women, were killed. The Gaza war and the inhuman hostilities and war carried out by Netanyahu's government of the right has led to a humanitarian catastrophe without this helping anybody, not bringing anybody closer to peace and security, neither in Israel nor in Palestine. An immediate ceasefire is absolutely necessary. Humanitarian aid must be provided for the Palestinians, and the hostages must be released. This is what must be done, and we have to inject life into the political process. Only thus can we end the killing in the region. We can provide security for the people in Gaza, in the West Bank as well, and we can suck the power out of Hamas as well. Only with the recognition of a Palestinian state will we have greater security for Israel. Next to a sovereign Israel, there has to be a sovereign Palestine as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shirdowan. Mrs. Gall now, 1 minute.
Elnök úr, főbiztos úr, határozottan elítéljük.
President, Commissioner, we condemn this attack against Israel because there is a danger that the Middle East will escalate into full-scale war, and that would endanger the security of Europe. It's important for us to deal with this situation. It's in our interests for this conflict not to bring the whole continent into flames. So we are committed to the security of Israel, and we also call for full sovereignty in the region, because a war can only lead to a new wave of migration towards Europe. So we need to deal with the situation in Lebanon, and we also need to deal with the situation of Syrian refugees. This is something that is in the interest of the United Nations. We need to ensure security. We need peace and stability in the Middle East in order to ensure our security, and that's just as important as peace in our neighbourhood. Thank you very much, Mrs. Gall. Now, Mr. McAllister, please.
Herr Präsident, Herr Hoher Vertreter, meine
President, High Representative, ladies and gentlemen, 2 weeks ago, all taboos were forgotten. And we've had this attack on the part of Iran. Iran has come out of the shadows now of this proxy situation, and the existence of the entire region, the danger of a war is palpable right now. Israel has excellent air protection and control as well as the airspace above its country, so it has succeeded in fending off the attack with the help of other countries as well. A European response is absolutely necessary right now. We have to find a policy that will reveal exactly what Iran is. It is a terrorist element. Mr. Borrell, now, we were informed the other day about the situation. Now, many situations, and I as well, have called for further sanctions against Iran. They have to be implemented immediately. But many colleagues from different groups as well have unfortunately expressed that the Islamic resolution and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard still is not on the terrorist list, that is something that has to be done immediately right now.
Thank you, Mr. McAllister. Mr. Pizzula now.
Dear colleagues, it has been more than 200 days since the terroristic attack of Hamas on Israel. Gaza is still suffering a catastrophic humanitarian situation. We have to calm down all the new conflicts that are daily taking place in the region. The Middle East is also in a situation that people in Yemen, in Iran, are also threatening the global security. However, it is precisely the escalation of tensions between Iran and Israel that is threatening us all the most. We have to take into account that the Iran's response was without the precedent. Both Israel and Iran have to stop the further spiral of violence, because it will only lead to the worsening of already chronically bad tensions in the region. That is why we should not be simply passive observers. We expect our leaders to take decisive steps in order to calm down the situation. We should have reacted in a unified way a long time ago. And in conclusion, we are witnessing further escalation, but the European Union has to work towards de-escalation. This will also make us more geopolitically influential, and the following mandate has to continue working in that direction.
Thank you very much, colleague Pizzula. Our next speaker is Madame Loiseau.
Chers collègues, il y a un
Dear colleagues, there's an intolerable paradox which I simply cannot resign myself to, and for which I would ask you to no longer give a free rein. Now, there is a certain political discourse which would have it that all countries are entitled to legitimate defense, every country except Israel. On the 7th of March, terrorists from Hamas killed, mutilated, raped, and took civilians hostage simply because they were Jews. And yet we heard a member of parliament from La France Insoumise speak of acts of resistance. On the 13th of April, Iran bombed Israel with missiles and drones, and yet the French Socialist Party called for an embargo of arms supplies to Israel. Bashar al-Assad's Syria has always been hostile to Israel, and yet the Rassemblement National supports blindly the Damascus regime. What have Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the Iraqi Shia militia or Syria? What do they have in common? Their submission to Iran, their systematic destabilizing role, and the hate of Israel. Tehran and its auxiliaries have stepped up their provocation if we want to pass on, avoid escalation. We have to give a firm message to Tehran. The Revolutionary Guard have to be defined as a terrorist entity and avoid all sanctions.
Thank you very much, Madam Loiseau. For 1 minute now, colleague Saturi.
Monsieur le représentant, avec
President, High Representative, with this resolution, we have a rare opportunity, one that we've been waiting for, and it's a way of us moving away from our double standards. We can firmly condemn the Iranian regime, but we should have done that vis-à-vis the Netanyahu government in exactly the same way. We missed that opportunity. What should be most important for us as Europeans, as members of the European Parliament, should be peace. We should be working towards de-escalation. The region is going up in flames. We have Israel's terrible attack going on, and if this continues, it's going to be a disaster for the region and for the world. It'll be a disaster for the peace that we all want to see so much. So it's time for us to make up for what we haven't done in the past. We need to call for a ceasefire, which is inevitable for us and necessary for us to move out of the current situation.
Eine Minute, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you very much, colleague Kanko. Now has the floor.
In the EU geproduceerde.
Now, how many components produced in the EU were used to build the missiles which were fired last week on Israel? Since November last year, it was taken you since then to come up with action to ban the supplies to Iran of certain components. Intentions are always expressed, but intentions do not provide any protection. Obviously, what did Iran have to do to get the EU to jump into action and do more than pay lip service to this? And the support of Iran to Hamas apparently wasn't sufficiently alarming. Cooperation with North Korea wasn't a sufficient threat. There were 800 executions back in 2023. This goes to show you it's quite clear what must happen. The sanctions are here now, but they're very late. Obviously, the situation would have been, if we don't qualify the Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization, we might as well have sent the missiles ourselves.
Colleague Vistisen.
For decades, the EU have acted like the useful idiots of Iran. For decades, we've been watching, observing, while day by day Iran has approached the development of nuclear weapons. We've let Iran make use of an Islamistic movement without saying it has to stop. It took ages before we in this parliament was willing to admit that Hamas is a terror organization. And even today, people here are discussing whether the IRGC, with all the weapons they send to Syria, to Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine, might be a terror movement. Just imagine if we in the EU have a so-called High Representative for Foreign Affairs. We do, somebody who believes himself to be our foreign minister on behalf of the EU, and he seems to be focusing on criticizing the only democratic country in that region, namely Israel. That seems to be more important to him than limiting the influence from Islamistic Iran. And Iran is not just active in the Middle East. We see examples in Denmark and France, in several European countries, of Iran trying to target us with terror. At times, they even succeed. We know that Iran is active in Europe through movements such as the Islamic Brotherhood and Hezbollah. And in that way, they're trying to spread Islamic movements in Europe. And we do nothing. We are their stupid, naive idiots.
Es folgt für eine Minute, Frau.
Thank you very much, colleague Ernst. Well, 350 million people are living right now on the brink of war. Where a war begins, we have a total burning of everything around. And the attack of Iran on Israel all goes hand in hand with the situation in Gaza and Israel, the shooting of the consulate as well, the bombing of the consulate by Israel, the death of so many people in Palestine as well. We have this policy right now where people are just taking revenge, and the result has been death of individuals. We want a strong civil society in Iran. And at the same time, Israel has to stop its war in Gaza. We need help. We need reconstruction in Gaza. The Middle East needs a new start. And the first step would be a ceasefire. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Ernst. Now for 1 minute, colleague Pignedoli.
Vogliamo parlare di de-escalation?
Do we want to talk about de-escalation in this House? Well, then we have to admit that the European Union had a specific role in military escalation in the Middle East because of what it did not do, because of its inertia. It just looked on and saw that international law was being flouted by Israel. It's killing an entire population. Genocide is taking place, and we can't even suspend a collaboration agreement. This is allowing countries such as Iran to flout international law, bringing us into a vicious circle of war. We find ourselves in a situation where there's delegitimization of international law, which is designed to protect us. The European Union must have a firm position. We must insist on respect for international law and introduce sanctions against any government violating international provisions, including Israel. This is our legal duty. It's also our moral duty and is indicative of our commitment for justice and the world peace. And our thanks to Josep Borrell for the work he's doing for Palestine.
Thank you very much, Madam Pignedoli. Now, colleague Lopez Isturiz White.
Gone are the days when some naive politicians in Europe and America thought that they could sit down with the Ayatollahs, lift some sanctions, and think that the Iranian regime would no longer pose a threat to us. Iran is a country that supplies the weapons that Putin's regime is using daily against the Ukrainian population. It is a regime that sanctions members of the European Parliament. It is a regime that orders assassinations on European soil against those who dare to denounce them, like our friend and former Vice President of the Parliament, Alejo Vidal Quadras. It is a regime that kills, tortures, and oppresses those who bravely decide to participate in peaceful protests. It is the supporter of terrorist organizations in Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, Iraq, Yemen. It is an unreliable autocratic government that is clearly trying to make a fool of us by continuing to pursue the development of nuclear military technology. It is time to legalize the Revolutionary Guard. It is time we change our approach and stay against the threat together of the Iranian regime. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Lopez Isturiz White.
Thank you very much, colleague. Our next speaker is Madam Yoncheva.
Thank you, President. I'll be speaking Bulgarian. Mr. Borrell, colleagues, Europe must be a leader in the initiative to achieve peace in the Middle East. It is very regrettable that the conflict is growing and is threatening the interests of the EU and the security of European citizens. A specific example is the daring attacks by the Yemeni Houthis in the Red Sea and the hostage-taking 6 months ago of 3 European citizens, 2 Bulgarians and 1 Romanian. The EU cannot leave this battle to the member states. If we're talking about leadership, it must be shown precisely in the field of diplomacy with a strong and proactive stance. Mr. Borrell, here we're also talking about double standards. If these were citizens of larger European countries, would it have come to this? This undermines the credibility of the EU and its ability to protect all European citizens, regardless of their nationalities. I turn to you, Mr. Borrell.
J'espère que vous allez soutenir une initiative diplomatique menée par l'Union européenne en vue de la libération.
I hope you're going to support a diplomatic solution to try and free the hostages. The European Commission needs to prioritise diplomatic efforts immediately, and I'd like to thank you for your response to what I say in advance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Verhofstadt.
I think this is my fourth debate, Mr. Borrell, about Iran with you. And every time the conclusion is the same. We don't like your strategy. We want that you change your strategy. Your strategy of diplomacy and appeasement leads to nothing at all. To nothing at all. And you are saying, yeah, but no, we did sanctions. What sanctions we did? Only 3 or 5 people. How many it are? You can tell us. I think it are 3, 4 or 5. Simply for exporting weapons to Russia. So this Parliament asks you to change the strategy based on real sanctions against the leadership of Iran. First. Secondly, recognizing the Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. I don't understand why you don't do it. And finally, don't start to continue with diplomacy towards the regime. It's time to recognize the opposition and to have direct contacts with them. They are the real representatives of the Iranian people.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Verhofstadt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verhofstadt. Now, colleague Guerrero.
Obrigado, caro Presidente, caro Alto Representante. Tal como a instabilidade entre Palestina e Israel não começou no 7 de outubro, também...
Thank you very much. With the situation now between Israel and Palestine, just as that conflict began, well, the Israel-Iran conflict didn't begin right now. It's a long story indeed that goes back in time. And we ought to remember that in 1953, we had a coup d'etat in Iran, a coup d'etat which led to, finally, after many years, the Islamic Revolution. And finally, we find ourselves in the situation that we see today. We have considerable sanctions. We have to support, of course, democratic forces in Iran, which are calling for change. They want for a secular regime to be put in power. And we have to work for a peace, in the direction of a peace process in the Middle East, which will culminate in a two-state solution. The far right has called here the High Representative a criminal, and actually there was no response to this terrible attack that was launched by the right. Mr. Terch.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning. Well, many people here are surprised about Mr. Borrell's position vis-à-vis Iran, which really responds to what Israel's doing rather than responding to the Iranian attack. Now, 5 years ago, Mr. Borrell tweeted on the 11th of February 2019, we still hadn't had the bad idea of having him here as the High Representative for Foreign Policy, and in that tweet he praised the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, talking about all the social progress that had taken place in the Islamic Republic. And in his tweets, there wasn't a single word of criticism of a regime that had killed tens of thousands of Iranian citizens, and which is one of the greatest enemies, not only of Israel, which it wants to destroy, but of the rest of the region as well. And I think that explains many things. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Tertsch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Terch. Our next speaker is colleague Sylvia Lima. Thank you very much, President. Not only today, I am here as a free, independent MEP, not as a representative of the AFD. Now, with regard to the rocket attack by the terrorist regime in Iran, but I think indeed this is quite clear. The EU has to act as far as Ukraine and Putin. It's two sides of the same coin, essentially. Unfortunately, not enough has been done. And as I think indeed the time has come, Mr. Borrell, to understand that the epicenter is not Gaza, but the terrorist attack on Israel of the 7th of October, and Hamas as a terrorist organization, and of course the Islamic Guard as well ought to be a terrorist organization. It's quite clear that those countries that have to be supported are those which are supporting Israel in its defense. And the most important thing is that we need decisiveness as far as stopping the development of a nuclear device in Iran. A bomb in the hands of Iran will be something that will be used not only against Israel, but against all of us. Thank you very much, colleague Lima. Our next speaker is colleague Botenga.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues, vous demandez une nouvelle sanction contre l'Iran.
Thank you, President, colleagues. To ask for other sanctions against Iran because Iran has reacted to Israel following its attack on its compound. So why not do the opposite? Israeli missiles sometimes end in Iraq. You call terrorists a part of the Iranian army. But what about the Israeli army? You send jets to protect military bases in Israel, but in 6 months, no Palestinian child enjoyed your protection. What's better, the 15,000 lives of Palestinian children or a military base? So either international law applies across the board to everybody, or we plunge into a world where the strongest wins. And this system of different yardsticks for different people is really crumbling the little bit of credibility which the EU has on the international scene. We cannot go on like this.
Herr colleague Botenga.
Colleague Botenga.
Ms. Kanko, please.
Chers collègues, j'aimerais vous...
I have a question for you, dear colleague. I would just like to ask you the following question. What would you call Hamas? What sort of organization do you believe Hamas is? And what do you think? What do you think about its participation and terrorism in Gaza? And what about the role it played on the 7th of October? And what would you have done in the place of Israel? And what would you say to the Jews of Israel and the world? Thank you.
Mais c'est là la différence fondamentale entre...
Well, that's where the fundamental difference lies between you and me. When Hamas commits terrorist acts or war crimes, I have no problem in condemning that. But when Israel commits war crimes and terrorist acts, you can't manage to condemn it. That's where your hypocrisy lies. You talk about releasing Israeli hostages, but you remain silent on the Palestinian children who are hostage in Israeli prisons. You condemn war crimes of those you don't like, but you support Israel blindly. And that's very, very easy. That's a basic hypocrisy. You're supporting the war crimes committed by Israel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Botenga. Our next speaker is colleague Sinčić.
The answer of Europe to Iran's strike is something that ignores the attack of Israel on the diplomatic mission in Damascus. There were thousands of airstrikes on Syria by Israel, and diplomatic premises were bombed. But only Netanyahu is allowed to do that. They call themselves the chosen peoples, although that has nothing to do with what they are. They want to save their regime, and 7,000 Israelis have settled on Palestine territory. This is something that needs to be condemned. And it is a shame that Palestine has not been acknowledged.
Eine Minute, Herr Kollege Gahler.
Herr Präsident, das
colleague, wait a second. Is it a blue card, colleague? Well, then no point of order. Please, Herr Kollege Gahler.
Herr Präsident, Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
President, colleagues, the Mullah's regime has produced a new level of escalation with its direct attack on Israel. And this, among other reasons, should be enough for us to finally act against a regime that is repressive internally against its own people, externally in its relations with Israel, and is also a wider threat in the region. It's also delivered drones and other weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine. And I think that makes it clear that no dialogue is possible with this regime. Even a vague hope that the nuclear agreement may produce something is not enough for us to finally act. Iran is part of the axis of evil with North Korea, and it's a problem for Israel, obviously. So we really need comprehensive, coordinated sanctions, coordinated with the United States, and we need really to support the democracy movement and women, life, freedom in Iran. That needs to be their future, and we should wholeheartedly support it. Thank you.
Thank you
very much, Mr. Gahler. Our next speaker for a minute is colleague Injir.
Colleagues, I want to start with echoing the words of the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Guterres, that the region is on the edge of abyss. The red lines are being crossed every day, unprecedented killings of civilians, media and humanitarian workers, missile attacks on other countries, foreign embassy buildings are being targeted, blocking of humanitarian aid, fuel for civilians. People in the region have been suffering for a long time, and I know it very well with my own roots from the region. We do need to condemn Iran's attacks on Israel with force, as well as condemn the attacks on consulate building and Israel's decision to carry out a counterattack. We need a de-escalation. De-escalation means that everyone needs to take their responsibility. We must work for de-escalation. We must work for democracy in the region, in Iran, through supporting the opposition, through supporting civil society, through putting the IRGC on the terrorist list, as well as we need to ensure end to the occupation of Palestine, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, that is leading to escalation, has done it for decades and continuously doing it for day by day. And we need to demand an immediate ceasefire now, an immediate permanent ceasefire now, and of course also an immediate release of the hostages. We need de-escalations, colleagues.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Inzir. Es folgt für eine...
Thank you very much, colleague Inzir. Our next speaker is colleague Ries.
Il y a donc cette rhétorique qui absout et qui...
This rhetoric that absolves, we even hear it here. On the night of the 13th of April, for the first time, Tehran attacked Israel directly without using its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. And this was 6 months after the traumatic night of the 7th of October, and apparently this was a justified response and is just part of the dispute between Israel and the Islamic Republic. This regime, which essentially is obsessed with destroying the Jewish state. It's a regime that is at war with women, which oppresses, kills the opposition, journalists, demonstrators, homosexuals, minorities. It's a regime that is just a few months away from getting nuclear weapons. And no, that doesn't conclude things. And the demands of the parliament are clear. We need to have sanctions against all individuals and entities involved. We need the guardians of the revolution to be put on the list of terrorist organizations. We need Hezbollah to be disarmed. We need the freeing of the hostages, including Ahmed Reza Jalali and all the others, and a genuine European policy of admission and returns for Iranians, which would enable us to avoid the 14 officials and members of the Basij organization wandering around Brussels, as happened last year. Thank you.
Our next speaker is colleague Butikova.
President, HRVP colleagues, Iran denies Israel's legitimacy in existing. The inverse is not the case. Whoever just describes recent developments as another act in the perennial cycle of action and reaction and ignores that fundamental reality is not a voice of reason, but a voice of confusion. Unprecedented, Iran's action is not just because it hasn't happened before, but because it represents a new world in which authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, sometimes using their terrorist helpers, try to coordinate to undermine the international order. You said, Josep Borrell, that the EU needs to speak the language of power. Do it. Why don't you put the IRGC on the terrorist list? You say sanctioning is not a policy. Not sanctioning is a policy. Act.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Bütikofer. Es folgt für eine Minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bütikofer. Mr. Royson is our next speaker.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, Iran is the major destabilizing force of the Middle East, and it has been so for years. And with the recent attack on Israel, this has simply been confirmed yet again. Their main objective is clear: to wipe Israel off the map by using terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and then dubious allies such as Russia, Pakistan, China, and North Korea. So Iran isn't simply a threat for Israel, but in actual fact for the entire international community. The long arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard reaches as far as Europe. But what about placing the Guard on the European list of terrorist organizations? Well, according to Mr. Borrell, allegedly there's no legal basis for this. But naturally, this is nonsense. This is purely a lack of political will. The Revolutionary Guard should be put on that list as soon as possible, and the package of sanctions against Iran must be extended. Israel must not stand alone. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Royson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Royson. Our next speaker is colleague De Graaf.
Israel bombardeert.
President, Israel is bombing the Iranian embassy in Syria, and by way of reaction, Iran then bombed two military areas in Israel. And apparently this is flouting international law, quite the opposite. What I would say to the EU citizens, in the EU, people are being forced to vaccinate. The opposition is being demonized. Our money has been taken, and it's been transformed into digital systems. But people are dying in Ukraine for multimillionaires in America. There are 500,000 dead and invalids. And, apparently the EU doesn't discriminate. children and people die in Ukraine. What I would say, for the next elections, vote against the EU.
Herr Kollege de Graaf, es folgt für eine Minute Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much. Colleague Mandel is our next speaker.
President, Commissioner, High Representative, colleagues, now it's revealed to the world that the Iranian regime is threatening Israel, the only Jewish state on earth, directly, not only via its proxies like in the past, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi in Yemen and other parts of the world. The Iranian regime is also threatening us via financing terrorism and Islamism on our continent, in our cities, in our rural areas. And I'm questioning why we have not earlier designated Revolutionary Guards as what they are, a terrorist organization. I have requested for that for many years. This very parliament has voted for it with a huge majority in January last year, but the High Representative Foreign Affairs Commissioner didn't act, as nearly always. So, Mr. Borrell, as I have thanked you for holding the role for some years during a different debate in this very last plenary week of this mandate, I really hope for the next Foreign Affairs Commissioner and High Representative not to follow your path, not to continue with these policies. We have to defend our security, the Europeans, meaning also ally with our allies.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Mandel. Es folgt für eine Minute.
Thank you very much, colleague Mandel. Our next speaker is colleague Cholo.
Iran's attack on Israel is an act of aggression which must be condemned, together with the crimes of Hamas, the hostage-taking and the intervention of Israel in Gaza. These all make this area a hotspot. The EU must do all it can to avoid the escalation of this conflict, because another front in that area will not only increase the number of lives lost, but will help Putin. Putin will be helped by any other conflict that will abate attention from what he's doing in Ukraine and will weaken support for Ukraine of the West. Diplomatic intervention is necessary because we still have the responsibility to release from the Houthis and from Hamas the hostages they took on the leadership, 2 Bulgarians and 1 Romanian. These are collateral victims in this conflict. And I would like to know, President, what is the EEAS doing to release these European citizens?
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Cholos.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Czarnecki, for 1 minute, please.
High Representative, since the October War, the world is gradually confirming the analysis that the Iranian resistance has been telling us for 4 decades. The Iranian regime is the head of the snake that creates war. The Iranian regime is active part of 2 main wars that are threatening European peace and tranquility. They are providing drones and missiles to kill Ukrainians, and they were the instigator of the war in Gaza with so many casualties. So it's high time to make Khamenei, the head of that snake, pay the price for making these wars. The European Union must immediately put IRGC on its terrorist list. We need to support the PMRI resistance units inside Iran and recognize the rights to fight against the regime.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Czarnecki. Es folgt für eine Minute Herr.
Thank you, Mr. Czarnecki. Mr. Bellamy now.
Even if de-escalation, which we all hope for, is being confirmed, there's no doubt about the fact that Iran is a threat. It's an existential threat for Israel, which it wishes to remove from the map. It's a threat for our countries. Our countries are targeted too by Islamist terrorism financed by Iran, and for its own people as well. Its people which is fighting with courage. But faced with this threat, everybody in Europe, however, is not keeping their eyes open. We heard the far left looking for excuses for Iran, just like it was looking for excuses for the 7th of October. And on the 6th of April, last, the French Socialist Party published a press release asking France to suspend deliveries of arms to Israel. To deprive Israel from its defense would make it vulnerable to the attack which it suffered 1 week later on the 13th of April. The same arms which were used to attack Ukraine. Now, it's up to you to say whether you're going to support. Microphone is off.
Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. Mr. Kovachev now for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Mr. Borrell. Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthi are responsible for the destabilization of the Middle East and the Black Sea. Every time there is new hope to normalize the relations between Israel and the Arabian state, Iran tries to undermine that, as they have just done. The direct attack on Israel by Iran is particularly worrying. The threats of navigation in the Black Sea should be put an end to. I'd like to emphasize that for about half a year, the crew of Galaxy Leader has been hostage of the Houthis. These seamen include Bulgarians, Romanians, Filipinos, and they should not be paying the price of the regional policy of Iran. Mr. Borrell, I turn to you and I encourage you to do everything you can so that European citizens that are hostage of the Houthi be freed as soon as possible so that they can return to their homes. And we have also insisted on numerous occasions to add the IRGC to the list of terrorists in Bulgaria, and sanctions should be imposed on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kovachev. Mr. Becker-Weinberg now for 1 minute.
Mr. President, honourable members, Mr. Borrell, on April 13th, Iran seized a Portuguese-flagged vessel along with its crew and cargo. We have little information on the conditions of detention of the crew, the vessel and its cargo. This is an illegal and unwanted act by the IRG. Therefore, I would second what my colleagues have mentioned about the importance of stating that IRG is a terrorist organization and sanctions should be applied forthwith. As we mark 200 days of the attack of the 7th of October, and after witnessing the barrage of missiles and drones launched by Iran against Israel, we must not forget the price of inaction. Mr. Borrell, Iran and Hamas do not care about the lawful right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, but only the destruction of the state of Israel and of the Jewish people. That is the context. In the EU, if we want to be an honest broker in the region, we must be able to understand this. Only after stopping Iran, we will be able to reach a two-state solution. A last point on the issue of anti-Semitism in this House. We just witnessed an anti-Semitic speech, and measures must be taken, and I will make sure that they will.
Thank you very much. We now have Mr. Zarzalejos for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. High Representative. So today, a debate on the escalation of hostilities in the Middle East, and indeed Iran's direct attack on Israel has elevated aggression to a much higher level. But this escalation is the result of Iran's proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and of course the Houthis as well. Iran is a world threat and is active in numerous different conflicts, not only in the Middle East, also in Ukraine. And indeed, that the sanctions are not a policy in themselves, but simply laying things aside is not the way to do it. Iran is an apocalyptic theocracy which bases its force on bloody repression, and also has its terrorist elements. It's already likely that Iran has nuclear capacity. Weaponization is around the corner. So this particular resolution is extremely important so that Iran can bear the consequences of not fulfilling its obligations. And finally, the Iranian people, the struggle of women, democratic opposition demonized by the theocratic regime in Tehran, all of these people and all of these organizations require the recognition and the support of the European Union for an Iran of peace and security in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the Catch the Eye procedure. Mr. Wallace, please.
Thanks very much, President. This place struggles to utter the truth about who bombed who first. Israel bombed Iran first. But this place has an imperialist worldview. How did ye come to hate the people of the Middle East so much that ye tried to exclude them from the realm of international law? Over the past 5 years, EU countries have been complicit through arms sales and direct military involvement in the war against Yemen that killed 400,000 people, the genocide in Gaza that's killed or maimed over 100,000 Palestinians in just 6 months, and in the sanctions against Syria and Iran that kill tens of thousands through preventable deaths every year. We have endless debates here about human rights, but these people you vote to crush are not afforded human rights. Ye pretend the EU is civilised. In your suits, you condemn people to die with your voting cards, blatantly lying to excuse your actions. The banality of evil. This place is a stain on humanity. Mr. Borrell, we respect your effort to bring some sanity to the place.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. Mr. Zver now, please.
Hvala za besedo, spoštovani gospod predsedujoči. Iran predstavlja dvojno nevarnost, najprej notranjo.
Thank you. Well, Iran is a dual danger. It's a danger internally because human rights are violated there systematically. And Mr. Borrell, you have never clearly taken a position in favour of the Iranian opposition. Now, the second danger is external, because Iran has an excellent military industry and can thus endanger EU military states as well. So the EU's response is too weak. Mr. Borrell, some of us are on the Iranian regime's black list. We're seen as terrorism, and you've never said anything in our support. So I get the feeling that you put Israel and Iran in the same boat. So that's why I would support two requests made by colleagues. So stronger sanctions are required, and we also need to put the Revolutionary Guard on the list of terrorist organizations. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now to conclude the Catch the Eye procedure, Mrs. Daly.
Thank you, President. I have to say, of all of the insane discussions that we've had in here, this one absolutely has to take the biscuit. Iran's unprecedented attack on Israel. As if Iran woke up one day and decided to strike Israel out of the blue. As if Israel's targeted attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria, which killed 16 people, a flagrant violation of the Vienna Convention, had never happened. Everybody outside this room knows the cause of the escalation is Israel. Everybody knows that Israel has been trying to broaden the conflict in the region to detract from their genocidal war on Gaza. And everybody knows that the EU, who for 7 months of the most proportionately destructive war in history have failed to condemn and sanction Israel, have immediately and unanimously condemned and sanctioned Iran for a disciplined retaliation which killed nobody. The world is changing. Your settler colonial project has been exposed like never before, and the world can see that the EU emperor has no clothes.
Thank you, Mrs. Daly. A point of order, is that right?
Yes, indeed, President. I consider the word insane to describe this debate as unparliamentary. Maybe you would want to make a remark.
Die Beurteilung dieser Frage werde ich der Präsidentin überlassen.
I will put this to the President. So, to conclude the debate, let me once again give the floor to the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Borrell, please.
Mr. President, honourable members, as Europeans, we all agree that our condemnation of the attack against Israel is clear. It's clear. It cannot be more clear. We have also reaffirmed our commitment to Israel's security. We all share the urgency to avoid further escalation and to work for restraint. And this call for restraint has to be addressed both to Israel and Iran. That's what we have done at all political levels. We will continue our diplomatic engagement with all key partners in the region. We will also expand the restrictive measures against Iran by expanding the already existing, it seems that you don't know, Iran-Russia-related sanctions regime to the region. Yes, it already exists. Do you want to give the floor to the member? No. Okay. Sorry, the President doesn't want to give you the floor. The world don't need another war in the region, and the people in Gaza neither. If the whole region of that war, the war in Gaza will not stop, and everybody agrees that this war has to stop, and the people in Gaza has to stop its suffering. There's nothing new. At all the statements of the European Union, this has been said. About some concrete questions, the EU maintains a comprehensive sanction on Iran, including more than 500 designated individuals. Mr. Verhofstadt, not 4 or 5, 500. You simply forgot to multiply by 100. That's a small mistake. A small mistake. 4 or 5, no. 500. You forgot 2 zeros. You have to go back to the school to learn a little bit about arithmetics. 500 President, what's happening here?
Herr Kollege.
Colleague, Mr. Verhofstadt, please, occasionally shouting out is okay, but you shouldn't be attempting to enter into dialogue with the High Representative off mic. Thank you.
Thank you. What I was saying was not 4 or 5. It was 500. 500 designated individuals and entities has been armed under the comprehensive sanctions against Iran. There is an arms embargo. There are missile technology and drone restrictions. There is a ban on equipment, which might be used for internal repression for all material. There is another ban for monitoring telecommunications. There is, on top, sanctions targeting human rights violations. We will also suspend existing Iran-Russia Federation drone regimes in 2 directions: the possibility of including missiles in addition to drones, the expansion of the regional dimension to be applied to the Iran-affiliated groups in the Middle East. About the Revolutionary Guard, we have already listed individuals and entities of the IRGC under the Iran human rights sanctions regime, under the territorial integrity of Ukraine sanctions regime, under the Syria sanctions regime, under the Iran weapons of mass destruction sanctions regime. Moreover, the European Union listed the IRGC in its entirety, under the Iran weapons of mass destruction sanctions regime. Under the Iran sanctions, the EU has listed the IRGC in its entirety under the Iran weapons of mass destruction sanctions regime, which already comprises an asset freeze and a prohibition to make funds and economic resources available. In other words, listing this organization as a terrorist organization would have no practical effect. The addition of entities or individuals to the so-called EU terrorist list, Common Position 931 sanction regime, is subject to a decision by the Council by unanimity and a national decision by a competent national authority, such as a court decision or a prescription order by an administrative authority, is a prerequisite for any additional listing. That national decision must have taken for acts that fall under the definition of terrorist acts under the sanctions regime in question. This is the situation. Maybe you should give the floor to these people.
Colleagues, it's quite normal to have interventions with short words, and Commissioner Borrell, you have been a parliamentarian. You even was the chairman of the President of the House, so you should be resilient enough to stand with that. But at the end of the day, if you continue and if you do it repeatedly, colleague Neumann and colleague Verhofstadt, then it's a sort of unpoliteness, and I for sure will call you for order if you continue that. Thank you. Commissioner Borrell.
No, I can only repeat what I've said. The addition of entities or individuals to the so-called EU terrorist list, Common Position 931 sanction regime, is subject to a decision by the Council of the European Union by unanimity, but a national decision by a competent national authority, such as a court decision or a prescription order by any administrative authority, is a prerequisite for any additional listing. That's what the legal services tell to me, tell to the Council. The national decision must have been taken for acts that fall under the definition of terrorist acts under the sanctions regime in question. That's what I have the honor to inform to the honourable members. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kommission.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, High Representative. I've received 7 motions for resolutions to wind up this debate. The debate is closed and the vote will be held tomorrow. Colleagues, the sitting is suspended for a few minutes. It will resume at 10:30 with the formal sitting on the 20th anniversary of the 2004 EU enlargement. Thank you.